We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Adeife Onwuzulike. She is the Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Euromonitor International. Adeife, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Thank you so much, Christina. I remember when I was asked what I want to be when I grow up, and I said I want to be a doctor. So I'm very far removed from that. But just for a background about myself. So as you said, my name is Adeife Onwuzulike, and I am the Director of DEI at Euromonitor. So I'm very passionate about diversity inclusion. It's something that's important to me. My background is in HR. So the foundations of a lot of the things we have to deal with stem from that. And that's good. It helps with the role. But I'm very passionate about driving change, especially on an intersectionality level, but also particularly on race, gender, disability, especially mental health as well. So a lot of the parts of the DEI agenda is really important to me, but I'm also very much trying to push the dial on certain areas that, for years have been a little bit more, difficult to push on.
Absolutely. I love that you brought up intersectionality and diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to mental health and people, human resources. Definitely can't think of creating equitable workplaces in a silo. And we were just talking about how this role is fairly new. What would you say is the current problem or situation you're trying to solve out of the many things I imagine?
I think for me, and just in my first, brief time so far, it's interesting because when we see DEI, especially in global organizations, you think it's DEI says, oh, the company is international, so they must be diverse, actually. But actually, there's more to it. It's not just how you are on a global scale, but how you are on a local scale. But also looking at how you, cater to the clients that you have, the business, how your brand speaks, how people can, feel akin to the work that you do and want to work with that purpose. So it's interesting I'm currently on I call it a listening tour of the business, but I find it so fascinating, the work that they've been doing. And it's really interesting where we're going to go on this journey together.
Absolutely. I think it's important to really recognize in terms of a global strategy, diversity, equity, and inclusion, really thinking about what those words mean, what the strategy means behind it as well. And when we're talking about company culture too, for an international organization, how do you think about measuring this dynamic thing, both from a qualitative lens and a quantitative lens, knowing that people experience the organization differently, people are in different time zones? What are your thoughts there?
I think from a qualitative and a quantitative is very interesting because I love data, right? But then the qualitative gives you that human-centric approach to understanding what's really going on, listening and really hearing from people on the things that data can show you, but it doesn't tell you, right? And so for me, looking at data from a quantitative approach helps me to understand, okay, so where are we on certain things? And you get to break it down. The data can show you things like representation. It can show you, depending on what kinds of questions you're asking, perceptions around inclusivity, around the culture for different groups of communities of people. But then the qualitative for me is really impactful, especially when you're thinking on it on a global scale, because when you're listening to people's lived experience and they're telling you about, the journey of their career, some of the challenges, how they got to where they got to, you use that to marry up with the quantitative data being presented to you, and it tells a wonderful story. And it's really fascinating just to hear that, not just on a UK, US stage, but actually on a global stage. And I think it's also is interesting, the different, stories and challenges that you hear from the different local areas that you're talking to as well.
Yeah, understanding people's lived experiences, what they're bringing into the workplace as well. We're not checking our identities or those experiences at the door, and listening at scale is something that we really believe in at AllVoices. It is so
Yeah.
important. And I think people are changing all the time. People are at different parts of their careers and lives, whether it
Yes.
is, something you've seen at Euromonitor right now or something in past roles at CBI or throughout your entire experience. Can you share a little bit about how you've or the team you worked with has redesigned a system to be more equitable over the past couple of years, especially these last two as we were in the beginning of the pandemic, whether it's process, policy, or initiative?
So I can talk through some of the previous things I've done within my other organization. It's interesting because I was there for just over 9 years, and we had to do a lot. The business I left when I was different to the business I joined when I joined the organization called the CBI, and we had to really look at, we talked a bit about data before, but we really had to get into it. When I started off the journey of DEI there, people were saying there isn't any. What is diversity? What's inclusion? We don't feel it. We don't see it. So we had to go into the data, whether it was, capturing the feedback of people leaving. But then the challenge with that is that they've now left. So you can't really make the changes because now you're reactive. I mean, it's good because you're helping those coming in, but it doesn't change the experience for them. So for me, it was, how do we then look at other types of data, pay gap data, to really help influence strategy for all people across the business? How do we, work across the different units? Collaboration is so important to me, and using collaboration across the business areas to really drive change, but also to influence the strategy, was empowering. And I think one of the key things for me that was helpful in that was employee networks, our affinity networks, the employee resource groups. They are, I can't talk highly of them enough, because I always talk about your voice being amplified when you're talking about diversity and inclusion. And sometimes when you're the sole change lead in the business, they listen to you, but it's different when there is a collective voice behind you saying, this is the change we need. And for us, it was about using those networks and resource groups to drive change, whether it was influencing policy, how we recruit, whether it was looking at introducing things that could help those with a disability, making those reasonable adjustments, but really making the environment truly inclusive for all. How we work, this last 2 years has been insane. We've had the pandemic, we had the murder of George Floyd, we had everything coming at us at once. And for many businesses, it really forced them to have to sit and listen and really understand what the needs are. I don't believe many people were talking about things like mental health before as much as they do now. I don't believe that they were understanding the lived experience, even topics about racism or, understanding your identity. Those things have all come together over the last 2 years to really influence our policy, the policies and strategies, but ultimately influence the business to make it not just look as if it's diverse, but also feel that way in conversation, in how we approach our clients, in also how we engage one another, and also how you challenge, especially when someone might say or do the wrong thing. It's all those things that come into play, and it's intricate, but it's so rewarding when it's done well. And this last 2 years has helped to kind of accelerate all of that change.
Absolutely. It's incredibly rewarding when you make something better for one person, one group of people. It's better literally for everyone, whether we're talking about working parents, we're talking about employees, a lot of different examples there as well. And I think, you acknowledge kind of where your past organization was in the equity journey when you got there, and when you left, it was a completely different place. And a lot of times, depending on where folks are, if it's, they hire their first diversity, equity, inclusion program manager, chief diversity officer. There are questions around investment and how do we know we're doing a good job? What is your philosophy around measuring diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging initiatives and strategies, knowing that we're not trying to check a box here, but what gets measured, we know gets funding, gets investment, gets time from people, etc.?
I think you have to do multiple things to measure progress, because you have to identify what kind of progress you're trying to measure. When you're looking at representation, and I know there are different data laws that can inhibit you from being able to capture certain things, but where possible, you can capture data on gender and ethnicity. And that enabled us, especially when we're doing things like our pay gap reporting, to really understand, you know, where do people sit in this business? It's enough to say, people say, oh, I don't see them at the top, but where are people sitting? And also, how can we move people across the organization? How do we enhance the employee experience so that they can see and feel that there is an opportunity for them to thrive and progress? So we use pay gap reporting data to do that. Another thing to measure progress overall on a cultural perspective is doing diversity and inclusion surveys, not just asking, or where are people based? That's the minimum, but actually asking people how they feel in terms of inclusivity around, as a non-binary, as a woman, as someone that with a mental health, physical disability, and so on. Do you feel that the organization is inclusive for you? Yes, somewhat, or no? And really asking those questions. It may seem for some people uncomfortable and hard hitting, but it's important, because measuring the culture is so important. It's bigger than just measuring diversity and measuring what people look, because I always say to people, you can attract people, but if your culture doesn't nurture them, they won't stay. They will leave as quickly as they joined. So measuring that progress was so important for us, but also using other ways to measure it, such as just having those conversations with people, using your networks to check in with their members and people that are within the organization. And it's just, for me, I always say, what are we trying to find out? Are we trying to find out how successful we are in creating a culture where everyone feels included? Or are we trying to measure how many people of different backgrounds have come into the organization, whether it's from a social background, class background, or whatever, and then taking that next step with that approach to really drive change. But simple things like pay gap reporting, it helps you to introduce opportunities like mentoring, sponsorship, and so on, to help people. And I know everyone's like, sometimes like, oh, sponsorship, who do you sponsor? Well, do you sponsor this group and not the other? Use the data. The data says to you there is an absence of representation of this community group in the business at this level. Then you use that approach to help you build it. So that's why data helps us to not just measure progress, but also think of some of the necessary actions to take place.
Absolutely. You have to think about the why, provide context, and think about what's the story that I ideally want to tell here as well, in terms of where we are we aspirationally to, and where can we have the biggest impact as well.
Yes.
I want
Yes.
to ask your opinion in terms of, equity work is a journey from your experience in equity, inclusion, diversity, human resources, and as for all of the experiences you have had as well. What is your perspective on, is it ever too late for brands to lean into equity work if they've caused harm? For example, there's a lot of toxic workplace series and documentaries as well around, public examples of companies who've had blatant discrimination lawsuits and toxic workplace cultures.
Yeah.
What is your advice for those organizations as well?
I think it's never too late to lean in. Most organizations have probably, either not failed to act, made a mistake, or whatever. One of the things that, I remember when I was many years ago, I studied my undergrad to do business in HR. And one of the things they talked about was Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and also how there's an employee psychological contract. Back in the day, at the most basics of level, it was about remunerate me, make sure that I get my pay and I'm happy, right? But now people want more. And so they want to see a business that is culturally sensitive and aware, but they also want to see a business that can stand up and say, I made a mistake and I own up to that, and take accountability for that, because that's where trust is built. We say to people, disclose your data. why should they? If they don't trust how you're going to use it. But that trust isn't built through just communication. That trust is built through how you interact, how you act, your actions. They, say actions speak louder than words. That plays a massive contributor to that. And I think for businesses, you can always start at some point. That you are never too far gone to come back to where you need to be and progress the agenda. But what stops people is either that they don't want to make a mistake. But what if you already made the mistake? Or they don't want to say the wrong thing, or they're not sure about language. Language is nuanced. Everyone's still learning language and on different diversity topics each day. I'm sure after the murder of George Floyd, many people realize certain things,
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it's about really just being transparent, saying I don't know everything. No one's supposed to know everything.
Yeah.
And just say, I'm here to learn, teach me. But I think one of the biggest things that will really be a decider for how people feel an organization is to committed to change, is going beyond the action of listening, because so many people are in listening mode right now. You can balance listening with some action. Don't just listen more and not do anything, because otherwise people will start to feel like you don't really mean it. And I think that's where the balance needs to be struck for organizations committed or saying that they want to do the right thing and actually doing the right thing, because that's where trust is built.
Yeah, you need to build that trust intentionally. You can't just say, I want to build an organization with trust and really good intent and say these words, but not support it with actions, really having a growth mindset as well. You're right. Nobody knows everything. And there's that Maya Angelou quote of, when you know better, you do better. So do better. We see a lot of organizations leaning into equity work, which is really great. And mistakes are made, especially when we are innovating, we're testing new things. Are there any common mistakes you're seeing companies making in their diversity, equity, inclusion strategies still today?
I think one of the mistakes people probably still are making is that fear is driving certain things. And when you're fearful, you don't take the full leap, you just dip your leg in the pond. And what the difficulty that brings is that your employees are looking for more than you just dipping your leg in the pond. And that in itself can be critical to the business, the perception of the business wanting to do something meaningful and drive change. And so I think it's not necessarily the lack of action or saying the wrong thing, because then there's the accountability, but it's about pushing yourself beyond your level of comfortability. Last year, since 2020, we've all been saying the slogan, be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And I think if you don't push that or build past that mindset, that's when things will start to go wrong, because people will say, well, you don't understand, you don't get it, I'm telling you this and you're saying this, and the answer to what you're saying is not showing that you're listening to the things that I'm saying to you. And that's because you're scared. You have to be vulnerable in DEI. You have to, and this is for leaders, managers, middle managers, you have to listen. You have to not be scared. I remember one of the things we did at the CBI, I was doing a workshop with them specifically on race and how to create environments that are inclusive for people when they're coming to events. And I said to them, so what would you do if someone makes an inappropriate comment and in jest or in banter?
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, oh, what do you do? I said, well, you tell them, I don't think that's appropriate at the moment. Can we pick this up afterwards? Many people were saying that, oh, they were nervous or they were scared to do that because they were like, oh, it's a big client. How would you feel? And I said, but what about the rest of the people in the room? Sometimes fear stops you from doing what is right. And you only do half the job. And that's where people start to think, they're not really committed. They just do it as a tick box exercise. And to avoid that, it's about really jumping into that pool, learning to sink or swim. Hopefully you swim, and riding the waves through. It's not a perfect wave. It's literally like jumping into the ocean and you don't know sometimes what you're going to find. But it's in that you're helping yourself to grow and to learn on all levels. And that's important to really driving change.
I think that is really important. I think just as equally as people can tell whether you are being authentic or not, people can tell if you're making fear-based decisions as well that causes inaction or just silence as well,
Yeah.
which is not helpful in this work if you're not leaning into vulnerability and empathy and taking those steps. I know you mentioned kind of managers and leaders, and we all have a role to play in this work to have that ownership mentality, but in terms of an organization and leaders, there is a unique position, I would say, for them to make
Definitely.
systemic changes. And I want to ask, what tools have you seen kind of managers or teams have as non-negotiables or just frameworks to proactively manage and be ahead of burnout as well?
Be ahead of what? I didn't catch the last bit. Be ahead of what?
Be ahead of burnout, like before
Oh,
they're
burnout. Oh gosh. Do you know what? Uh, I honestly think in the last 2 years, a lot of people have been burnt out. I laugh, but it's very serious. And especially those doing the DEI work that we're doing, managers, because here's the thing, prior to the pandemic, managers were just there to manage, right? So there's a sympathy I feel for them. Now you're expected to be culturally aware, have your knowledge around DEI in different individuals, language should be clear, then you're still doing performance, then you're still encouraging. So there's a lot going on. And you've got the pressures of your day-to-day job going on, right? But it doesn't make it easier, but at the same time, it's part of now what people are deeming to be good leaders, one that is aware of those things. But how you manage burnout is also with transparency and conversation, because life is busy, life is picking up now, and it's getting busier and busier. And I think some people are still dealing with the burnout of the last 2 years and the impact of that, because for some of these managers, they may have lost somebody, they may have gotten sick, their health, and so many things has happened, right? So you have to think inclusively in that lens as well about all the other factors that could affect a normal individual, but also a senior manager. And so you have to be thinking about, if we're going to manage burnout, it's not the manager's responsibility, it's the whole business responsibility. The language we use to thinking about burnout, mental health, and wellness needs to change so that everybody feels it. Some of the things I saw the last 2 years is people have now done, mental health awareness days, taking well-being days, introducing things like that to make people stop and pause. But then what I've also heard on the flip side is people say, oh, well, the work that I didn't do today is building up for tomorrow. So sometimes it feels like you're never getting it right, but you may please one and not please the other, right? But actually, it's about finding out what best works for your organization and really thinking about, if it's burnout because of what? Is the burnout because of the pressures that's coming in externally, or is the burnout coming in from the pressures within? Is it workload and so on? And what are you going to do proactively to change that? I think sometimes we always try and put a bandage over the wound, not actually solving or what caused the wound to happen in the first place. And so if burnout is there, which is what is showing in the wound, what caused it? Figure that out first and then work it out. But for many people, it's either well-being days, training, introduction of yoga, nutrition, so on and so forth. But the reality of it, and I keep saying this to people, burnout is a result of how you're feeling internally, projects itself externally. And the thing is, internally, people are tired and people just need a moment. And because the world was locked up, people that would use an output to travel can't travel. And so now that everyone's like, where's my release? Where can I go? What can I do? Right?
Yeah.
And so it's about really finding out, one, what is the best thing for you as an individual, for the business, but two, what caused it, and really taking an introspective approach to it. I've seen many people now use things like employee assistance program, therapy, counseling to help them deal with that. And it's about being comfortable, but the challenge you have is that not everybody feels comfortable talking about that. Leaders, managers don't always feel comfortable talking about, I'm in counseling, I'm in therapy, I'm receiving different treatments, because it seems frowned upon. And you would have thought after the pandemic we would have shifted from that. But you still see that in different organizations today. So I think there is a lot to do. There's a lot that people have done, but to find out what the true cause is, you need to sit down and reflect, and to be able to find a tangible solution to the problem, instead of just putting things over to just kind of cover it, but not actually solving it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that there has a lot that has been done, as to your point, and also there's a lot that can be done. And I think when we're looking at stories of different organizations implementing mental health days and a lot of great benefits too, those are incredible ideas. But look internally at your employees and simply ask and have the conversation as well, knowing that the answers will change over time. And again,
Yeah.
create the best place to work for your team and for your organization overall is critical. You
Yeah.
mentioned that this work is really hard. Change doesn't happen overnight. What is one of your proudest moments?
I think, if I can say to you, I think one of my proudest moments, in relation to the organization I've just left, the CBI, is just seeing the change. I think people have now said to me is that they feel like things like allyship that we talk about, sometimes that seems a faraway concept. And now, it was made real to them through workshops that we ran. But also, people now feel comfortable talking about the things that they feel, are issues. If you don't like something, say it, and not just brush under the carpet and then let that affect your mental health and well-being. But then what I've also seen is that leaders also start saying, I don't know, and tell me what is wrong. But also people saying, I'm here to tell you what's wrong. I'm not going to give you the solution to it. And then the conversation has changed now, because sometimes when you talk about DEI, you're expecting the individual that is going through the stuff to tell you what to do to solve it, and it's not their job. It's really not their job. It's for you as the person. I always say Google is your best friend, but also listening is your best friend too. If you listen well enough, you will understand how to solve the issue. So for me, my proudest moments is just to see an overall change in conversation, not just in the organization I was in, but with all some of the members that the organizations I worked with, and to see the change and to see people just feel more empowered, and own that empowerment and really use that to drive themselves and their careers. I think that's it's different, and it's just encouraging.
Absolutely. I think that is really encouraging, having the conversation, and it's great when people give you that feedback directly as well to see the impact you have had long term. Is there anything that I didn't ask in our conversation today that you want to share with folks who are listening, or maybe underscoring 1 to 2 key takeaways about the many things that we discussed today?
I think one of the things I would just say is, we underestimate conversations and how important they are. I always say to leaders, have the conversation to listen, not to question, but to learn. But this goes for everybody. When you're learning about something that is a new phenomenon to you, sometimes our response is to ask the question and keep going.
Yeah.
But I would encourage people to just listen to learn, be an active listener, because that's where you start to understand the different perspective. But also, if you don't understand it because you've never seen it, never lived it, it's not for you to question or doubt it, but actually to gain a better understanding through doing your own personal research. Because more likely than none, that one person saying it to you, there are probably 10 or 15 people behind them that have also had that same experience. And the goal for you, if you're a leader, is to listen and learn, but have healthy conversations. And that's like I say.
I think that is a great call to action to end our conversation. Really have those conversations, continue to have them, and lean into this work. Adeife, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, at All Voices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.